My hands are shaking as I tell you this story, and I'm 81 years old. I've had plenty of time to steady them, but some memories, they never stop rattling your bones. It was 1967 when I became Mrs. Betty Scott, and Lord, did I think I'd won the lottery. Picture this. A 19-year-old girl from the wrong side of Harlan County, Kentucky, where coal dust settled on everything like a permanent shadow, and the only futures we girls could see were working at the diner or marrying whoever asked first. Then along came Sheriff Thomas Scott, 32, clean-shaven, with a badge that caught the light just right, and a smile that made my mama forget we barely had enough cornmeal to last the week. Betty's going to be somebody now, she whispered to the church ladies after he proposed with his grandmother's ring. A thin gold band with a chip of diamond so small you had to squint to see it, but it might as well have been the crown jewels the way everyone carried on. Thomas owned the biggest house on Maple Street. White clapboard with green shutters and a porch that wrapped around like an embrace. 3 bedrooms upstairs, indoor plumbing, and a kitchen with countertops that weren't made from scrap wood. When he carried me across that threshold, I felt like Cinderella finally getting her castle. The whole county watched us drive away from the church in his patrol car, tin cans rattling behind us, and I thought, this is it. This is what happily ever after looks like. But happiness, I learned, can be a costume that looks perfect from the outside while it's suffocating you underneath. The first few months were sweet as honey on fresh biscuits. Thomas would come home in his pressed uniform, hang his gun belt on the special hook by the door, and tell me about his day keeping our community safe. He'd pull me close and say, "Betty, darling, you make this house a home." I'd cook his favorite pot roast, iron his shirts until they were crisp enough to cut glass, and listen to his stories about chasing speeders and breaking up bar fights. He was the law in our county, respected and feared in equal measure, and I was his wife, protected, untouchable. The townspeople treated me different now. Mrs. Henderson at the grocery store always had the best cuts of meat set aside. The bank president tipped his hat when I walked by. Even the rough men who hung around the courthouse steps would straighten up and say, "Afternoon, Mrs. Scott," with genuine respect in their voices. For a girl who'd grown up invisible, it was intoxicating. But there were signs. Little things that made my stomach flutter in ways that had nothing to do with the baby growing inside me. Like how Thomas's jaw would tighten when other men looked at me too long. How he'd grip my elbow just a little too hard when we walked into church together, his fingers finding the soft spots where bruises wouldn't show under my Sunday dress sleeves. How he'd count the change in my purse when I came back from the store, even though he'd given me the exact amount I needed. "A sheriff's wife has to be above reproach," he'd say, straightening his tie in the hallway mirror. "People are always watching, Betty, always looking for reasons to tear down what we've built." I nodded and smiled because that made sense. Of course people would watch us. Of course I had to be perfect. I was married to the most important man in the county. When I was 6 months pregnant with our first baby, Thomas started working longer hours. "Crime doesn't sleep," he'd say, kissing my forehead before heading back out into the Kentucky night. I'd sit in that big house, my hands resting on my growing belly, listening to the grandfather clock in the hallway tick away the hours. Sometimes I'd hear his patrol car pull up at 2, 3 in the morning, the engine ticking as it cooled, but he wouldn't come in right away. I'd peek through the bedroom curtains and see him sitting there in the darkness, just sitting. The baby kicked hard those nights, like she could sense something I couldn't quite name yet. Looking back now, with all these years between me and that young woman, I can see what I couldn't then. How the golden handcuffs were already locked around my wrists. How the badge that had seemed like my ticket to safety was becoming the very thing that would trap me. How respect and fear are sometimes the same emotion, just wearing different masks. But I was 19, and pregnant, and so grateful to be chosen by someone important that I mistook control for love. I thought the tightness in my chest when he looked at me a certain way was just excitement. I thought the way he always knew where I'd been and who I'd talked to was proof of how much he cared. I had no idea that some cages are built with white picket fences and welcome mats. I had no idea that the most dangerous predators are often the ones everyone else calls heroes. The baby was due in 3 months when everything started to change. When the mask Thomas wore for the rest of the world began to slip, and I got my first real glimpse of the man I'd actually married. But that's a story for tomorrow. The first time Thomas hit me, I was 7 months pregnant and making cornbread for Sunday dinner. I know what you're thinking. How could I not see it coming? But that's the thing about living with someone who wears authority like a second skin. The warning signs don't look like warning signs when everyone in town calls your husband a hero. It started that morning when I dropped his coffee cup. Just a simple white mug, nothing fancy, but it slipped right through my swollen fingers and shattered across our kitchen floor. The sound echoed through the house like a gunshot, and I immediately dropped to my knees, trying to pick up the pieces with my bare hands. "Betty." His voice was calm. Too calm. The kind of quiet that makes your skin crawl because you know thunder's coming after. "What did you just do?" I looked up at him from the floor, ceramic shards cutting into my palms, my pregnant belly making it hard to balance. "I'm sorry, Thomas. It was an accident. My hands are so swollen these days, I can barely hold on to anything." He stood there in his Sunday clothes, crisp white shirt, black slacks, his sheriff's badge pinned perfectly straight on his chest, even though he wasn't working. Thomas never went anywhere without that badge. It was like it had grown into his skin. "Get up." I struggled to my feet, leaving small drops of blood on the linoleum where the ceramic had cut me. The baby was pressing against my ribs, making it hard to breathe, and I had to brace myself against the counter. "Do you know what that cup cost me, Betty?" The question hung in the air like smoke. I wanted to say it was just a cup from the 5 and dime, probably cost 50 cents. But something in his eyes, something cold and calculating, made me stay quiet. It cost me respect. His voice was getting softer, which somehow made it more terrifying. "When I can't even keep my own wife from breaking things in my house, what does that say about my ability to keep order in this county?" Before I could process what was happening, his hand connected with my cheek so hard I saw stars. The force knocked me sideways into the kitchen table, and I felt something warm and wet trickling from my nose. My hands flew to my belly, protecting the baby, while my ears rang from the impact. "Thomas," I whispered, tasting copper. He grabbed my chin, forcing me to look at him. His fingers dug into my skin like he was trying to leave permanent marks. "This is what happens when you embarrass me, Betty. When you make me look weak." His thumb pressed against the bruise he'd just made, and I bit back a whimper. "Do we understand each other?" I nodded, tears streaming down my face, and he smiled. Actually smiled, like we'd just had a pleasant conversation about the weather. "Good girl." He kissed my forehead, right above where blood was still dripping from my nose. "Clean this mess up and get that cornbread in the oven. We can't be late for church." He walked out like nothing had happened, and I stood there in that pristine kitchen, shaking and bleeding and trying to understand what had just occurred. This was Thomas, my Thomas, the man who held my hand during morning prayers and told me I was the most beautiful woman in Kentucky, the man who'd promised to protect and cherish me until death do us part. But the bruise on my face was real, the blood on my hands was real, and the fear spreading through my chest like ice water, that was real too. I cleaned up the mess with trembling hands, put the cornbread in the oven, and went upstairs to fix my makeup. In the bathroom mirror, I stared at my reflection. Split lip, bruised cheek, eyes red from crying. I opened my compact and started covering the damage with powder and lipstick, the same way I'd watched my mama do 100 times when I was little. Because that's what women did in 1967. We covered up, we made excuses, we smiled, and pretended everything was perfect, especially when our husbands were respected men who could do no wrong in anyone else's eyes. At church that morning, Thomas kept his hand on my lower back, guiding me to our usual pew in the front row. The congregation smiled and waved. Mrs. Patterson commented on how radiant I looked. The preacher asked Thomas to lead the closing prayer, and I watched my husband stand up there with his badge, catching the light streaming through the stained glass, talking about righteousness and protection and doing God's will. "Lord, help us to be guardians of what's precious," he prayed, his voice carrying to every corner of that little church. "Help us to maintain order in our homes and our community, and to never let chaos take root where peace should flourish." Everyone said amen, like they'd been blessed by an angel. I sat there with concealer covering my bruises, my unborn baby pressing against my ribs, and realized I was completely alone. Who was I going to tell? Sheriff Thomas Scott, pillar of the community, had hit his pregnant wife? They'd think I was crazy. Or worse, they'd think I deserved it. The baby kicked hard during the sermon about obedience, and I pressed my hands against my belly, silently promising her that I would figure this out, that I would keep her safe, even if I couldn't keep myself safe. But promises are easy to make in church on Sunday morning. Living up to them when you're trapped in a house with someone who wears a gun and has the entire county believing he's their savior, that's something else entirely. That afternoon, while Thomas napped in his recliner with a football game playing on the television, I stood at my kitchen window looking out at Maple Street. Normal families were having normal Sunday dinners. Kids were playing in their yards. Everything looked peaceful and perfect, just like my life looked from the outside. But I was starting to understand that the most dangerous prisons don't have bars. They have reputations to protect and communities that refuse to see the truth, even when it's bleeding right in front of them. The worst part? I still loved him. Even with my face throbbing and my heart broken, part of me still believed this was just a bad day, that the real Thomas would come back, that the man I'd married was still in there somewhere, underneath the badge and the rage and the need to control everything around him. I had no idea how much worse things were about to get. Please, my dear, tell me in the comments, which town are you watching from? And what time of the day did you find this video? Are you having your morning coffee or exercise, or perhaps resting after lunch, or just chilling in your bedroom at night? I'm happy to know where you're from, and when you take out time to listen to this grandma's stories, and please don't forget to subscribe to this channel because our voice matters. 3 weeks after that first slap, our daughter Sarah was born during the worst snowstorm Kentucky had seen in 20 years. I'll never forget holding her for the first time, this tiny, perfect thing with Thomas's dark hair and my stubborn chin. She was so small, barely 6 pounds, but when she wrapped her little fingers around mine, I felt stronger than I had in months. Like maybe, just maybe, having someone who needed me would give me the courage I'd been missing. Thomas cried when the doctor placed her in his arms, real tears streaming down his cheeks as he whispered, "She's beautiful, Betty. She's perfect." For a moment, standing there in that hospital room with snow falling outside our window, I thought we might be okay. I thought becoming parents would soften whatever hard edges had been growing inside him. I was wrong about a lot of things back then. The first few weeks at home were like walking on eggshells made of ice. Thomas was different, more watchful, more controlling. He'd installed new locks on all the doors, the kind that needed keys to open from both sides. For security, he said, checking them obsessively every night before bed. Can't be too careful with a baby in the house. But those locks weren't keeping danger out. They were keeping us in. Sarah was 6 weeks old the first time he locked us in the pantry. I remember every detail of that night like it happened yesterday, not 45 years ago. She'd been fussy all evening, that crying that babies do when nothing seems to help. And I was exhausted from trying to nurse her and keep her quiet at the same time. Thomas had been drinking. Not his usual 1 or 2 beers with dinner, but serious drinking. The kind where his words got slower and his eyes got that flat, dead look that made my stomach clench with fear. He was still in his uniform from work, his badge reflecting the kitchen light every time he moved. "Make her stop," he said around 10 o'clock, not even looking up from his newspaper. "I'm trying, Thomas. Sometimes babies just cry. The doctor said it's normal." I said, "Make her stop." His voice cut through Sarah's wails like a blade. "I've got to go back out on a call in an hour, and I need quiet to think." I bounced her, shushed her, tried everything I knew, but she kept crying. That helpless, desperate sound that breaks your heart and makes you feel like you're failing at the most important job in the world. My own exhaustion was making me shaky, and I could feel Thomas's anger building like pressure in a kettle about to blow. Then, Sarah's crying reached that pitch that seems to hit right behind your eyeballs, and something in Thomas snapped. He was up from his chair so fast his newspaper scattered across the floor. In 3 long strides he was across the kitchen, grabbing my arm hard enough to bruise. "I told you to shut her up. Thomas, please, she's just a baby. And you're her mother. Act like it." Before I could react, he was pushing both of us toward the pantry. It was a small space, maybe 4 feet by 6 feet, with shelves full of canned goods and cleaning supplies. The smell of pine sol and green beans in a space that size was overwhelming on a good day. "Get in there," he said, shoving me hard enough that I stumbled. "Both of you. Stay there until you figure out how to be quiet. Thomas. We can't, this is crazy." But he was already slamming the door shut. I heard the click of the key turning in the lock, then his footsteps walking away. Sarah was still crying, and now I was crying too, standing there in the dark with my 6-week-old baby, trying to understand what had just happened. The pantry had no windows, no light switch inside, just darkness that pressed against you like something alive. Sarah's cries echoed off the walls, seeming louder in that tiny space, and I sank down onto the floor, pulling her close to my chest. "Shh, baby girl," I whispered against her soft hair. "Mama's here. Mama's here." I don't know how long we stayed in there. Could have been an hour, could have been 3. Time moves different when you're locked in the dark with a crying baby, and the man you married has just shown you exactly how trapped you really are. I tried the door handle probably 50 times, knowing it wouldn't budge but needing to try anyway. The metal was cold under my palm, as unmovable as everything else in my life. Sarah eventually cried herself to sleep against my chest, exhausted and probably hungry. I sat there in that darkness, listening to her tiny breathing, and felt something inside me break that I don't think ever fully healed. This wasn't about a fussy baby. This wasn't even about his drinking, though that was certainly making everything worse. This was about power, about showing me that he could take away my freedom, my dignity, my basic right to comfort my own child anytime he wanted. The badge on his chest wasn't just his authority over the county, it was his authority over me. When he finally opened the door, I don't know what time it was, late enough that the house was completely quiet except for the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. He stood there in the doorway, still in his uniform, backlit by the kitchen light, like some kind of dark angel. "You ready to keep her quiet now?" he asked, like we'd just had a reasonable conversation about household management. I nodded, not trusting my voice. Sarah was still sleeping against my chest, her little body warm and trusting, and I would have agreed to anything to keep from going back in that closet. "Good." He stepped aside to let us out. "I've got another call. Might be out most of the night. When I get back, I want this house peaceful." He left without another word, and I stood there in my kitchen, holding my sleeping daughter, trying to process what had just become my new normal. The pantry door was still open behind me, like a mouth waiting to swallow us up again. That night, I sat in the rocking chair by Sarah's crib and made a mental list of everyone I could call for help. My mama was dead, my sister lived 3 states away and had her own problems. The church friends who'd smiled at our wedding, they all thought Thomas walked on water. The other wives in town, their husbands worked for Thomas, or worked with him, or owed him favors. By dawn, I'd realized the truth that would haunt me for the next several years. I was completely alone in a town where my husband was the law, with a baby who depended on me and nowhere safe to run. But something else had happened in that pantry, something Thomas didn't know about and couldn't control. In that darkness, holding my daughter and feeling the full weight of my powerlessness, a tiny spark of rebellion had been born. It was small, barely alive, but it was there. And sometimes, that's all you need to start planning your escape, even if it takes you years to find the courage to use it. Sarah was 8 months old when I realized Thomas wasn't just drinking at home anymore. He was drinking on duty. I should have known something was wrong when he started coming home at strange hours, sometimes not until 3 or 4 in the morning, reeking of whiskey and something else I couldn't quite place. Something metallic and sharp that clung to his uniform like smoke. The pantry had become our regular punishment by then. Any little thing could set him off. Sarah's crying, dinner being 5 minutes late, me asking too many questions about where he'd been. That tiny, windowless space had become as familiar as our bedroom, and I'd learned to keep a small flashlight hidden behind the flour sacks and a bottle of water tucked next to the canned peaches. But it was the night of March 15th, 1968, that everything changed. The night I realized my husband wasn't just an angry drunk, he was something much more dangerous. I was nursing Sarah in the living room when his patrol car pulled up around midnight. Usually, Thomas tried to be quiet when he came home late, not wanting to wake the baby. But that night, he slammed the car door so hard it rattled our front windows. Then I heard him stumbling on the porch steps, cursing under his breath. When he walked through our front door, I barely recognized him. His uniform shirt was untucked and stained with something dark. His badge was crooked, hanging half off his chest like he'd been in some kind of struggle. But it was his eyes that scared me most, wild and unfocused, with a look I'd never seen before, like he'd crossed some line he could never come back from. "Betty," he said, swaying slightly. "Betty, we need to talk." I pulled Sarah closer to my chest, her little body warm and trusting against me. "Thomas, what happened? Are you hurt?" He laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. It was hollow and bitter, like glass breaking in your throat. "Hurt? No, darling, I'm not hurt." He collapsed into his recliner, and I could smell the whiskey from across the room. "But that boy from the Morrison farm, well, he won't be causing any more trouble." My blood turned to ice water. "What boy? What are you talking about?" Thomas leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, and for a moment he looked almost vulnerable, like the young man I'd fallen in love with was still buried somewhere under all that anger and alcohol. "Danny Morrison. You remember him? That colored boy who's been uppity lately, talking about voting rights and stirring up trouble at the diner?" I remembered Danny. Sweet kid, maybe 19 years old, always polite when he came into town with his family. Never caused trouble that I could see. Just existed in a way that apparently bothered some folks, including my husband. "What about Danny, Thomas?" His laugh got darker. "Let's just say he had an accident tonight. Real unfortunate accident. Seems like he fell down some stairs at the jail. Several times." The room started spinning. I held Sarah so tight she made a little protesting sound, and I forced myself to loosen my grip. "Thomas, what are you saying?" "I'm saying some people need to learn their place, Betty, and sometimes it's a sheriff's job to teach them." He stood up, swaying, and started unbuttoning his shirt. That boy thought he could mouth off to me, thought he could demand his rights and make me look weak in front of my deputies. Had to show him different. I watched my husband strip off that blood-stained uniform shirt, and I realized I was looking at a stranger. Or maybe I was finally seeing who he'd been all along, and I'd just been too young and desperate to notice. Is Danny okay?" I whispered. Thomas stopped mid-motion, his shirt half off, and looked at me with those cold, flat eyes. "Danny Morrison is exactly where he needs to be, Betty. And if you know what's good for you and that baby, you'll forget we ever had this conversation." But I couldn't forget. How could I? The man I'd married, the man I'd trusted to protect our community, had just told me he'd beaten a teenager for wanting basic human rights, and he told me like he was describing the weather. That night, after Thomas passed out in his chair with an empty whiskey bottle at his feet, I sat in Sarah's nursery and stared at my sleeping daughter. She was so innocent, so perfect, with her tiny fists curled next to her cheeks and her chest rising and falling in that peaceful rhythm that only babies have. What kind of world had I brought her into? What kind of man was she going to call Daddy? The next morning, I walked to the grocery store with Sarah in her stroller, and I heard the whispers. Danny Morrison was in the hospital with a broken jaw, 3 cracked ribs, and internal bleeding. Resisted arrest, people were saying. Had it coming, others added. Sheriff Scott was just doing his job. Mrs. Henderson at the checkout counter leaned close when she handed me my change. "That Morrison boy should have known better than to cause trouble," she said quietly. "Your husband's a good man, Betty. He keeps the peace around here." I nodded and smiled, the way I'd been trained to do, but inside I was screaming. This was peace? A 19-year-old boy in the hospital because he dared to speak up? A sheriff who came home drunk and bloody and bragged about it like he'd won some kind of prize? Walking home, I pushed Sarah's stroller past the courthouse where Thomas worked, and I saw his patrol car parked in its usual spot, clean and shiny, like it had never been used to transport a beaten teenager to jail, like it had never carried my husband home, covered in another person's blood. That afternoon, while Thomas slept off his hangover, I did something I'd never done before. I called the state police. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely dial the number, and when a man answered, I almost hung up. But Sarah made one of those sweet baby sounds from her crib, and I found my voice. I need to report. I think there might have been some excessive force used in an arrest last night. The officer on the other end sounded tired, like he'd heard this before. What's the nature of the complaint, ma'am? A boy named Danny Morrison was injured during an arrest. I think he might have been beaten. Long pause. Then, and who's the arresting officer you're referring to? This was it. The moment I either found my courage or lost it forever. Sheriff Thomas Scott of Harlan County. Another pause, longer this time. When the man spoke again, his voice had changed completely. Colder, more careful. Ma'am, I'm going to need your name and contact information. I can't give you that. Then I'm afraid there's not much we can do. Sheriff Scott has an excellent reputation with this department. Without a formal complaint from a credible witness, our hands are tied. I hung up the phone and stood there in my kitchen, holding the receiver until the dial tone turned into that harsh beeping sound that means you've been disconnected from everything. That's when I realized the truth that would shape the next several years of my life. The badge that made Thomas untouchable in our county also made him untouchable everywhere else. The system that was supposed to protect people like Danny Morrison, and people like me, was the same system that protected men like my husband. I was truly on my own. But something had changed in me during that phone call. Something small, but important. For the first time since I'd married Thomas, I'd tried to fight back. I'd tried to do the right thing, even though it hadn't worked. And maybe, if I could find the courage to try once, I could find the courage to try again. Even if it took years. Even if it nearly killed me in the process. By the time Sarah turned 2, I'd become an expert at reading the signs. The way Thomas's jaw tightened when he walked through the door told me whether I had 5 minutes or 5 seconds before the yelling started. The particular sound his boots made on the hardwood, heavy and deliberate versus quick and angry, let me know if I should grab Sarah and head for the pantry, or if I might have time to get dinner on the table first. But nothing could have prepared me for what I discovered on that humid July evening in 1969. Thomas had been working late all week, coming home after Sarah's bedtime with that same metallic smell clinging to his clothes. When I asked about it, he'd brush me off with talk about official business and things you wouldn't understand. I'd learned not to push. Pushing led to bruises, and bruises led to questions at the grocery store that I couldn't answer. That Tuesday night, he forgot his wallet. I found it on the kitchen counter the next morning, thick with cash and papers sticking out at odd angles. Thomas never left his wallet behind. It was as much a part of his uniform as his badge or his gun. The man was meticulous about everything, especially anything that had to do with his authority. I should have just driven it to the courthouse and left it with his secretary. That would have been the safe thing to do, the smart thing. Instead, I opened it. At first, everything looked normal. His driver's license, some business cards, a photo of Sarah from her first birthday. But tucked behind his insurance card, I found something that made my hands start shaking so hard I nearly dropped the whole thing. Money. More money than I'd ever seen in one place, bundled together with a rubber band. 20s and 50s, crisp like they'd come straight from the bank. I counted it twice, not believing what I was seeing. $800, more than Thomas made in 3 months at the sheriff's department. And underneath the money, there was a piece of paper with names written in Thomas's careful handwriting. Names I recognized from around town, followed by numbers that looked like dates and dollar amounts. Bobby Jenkins, $50. July 3. Mike Patterson, X, $75. X, July 8. Carl Morrison, AGA, $100. AGA, July 12. Carl Morrison, Danny's father. My stomach dropped to the floor as the pieces started clicking together in my mind. The late nights, the extra money, the way certain arrest reports seemed to disappear from Thomas's desk, the reason Danny Morrison's beating had never been investigated, even after my anonymous call to the state police. My husband wasn't just a corrupt sheriff. He was running protection rackets, taking money from people to look the other way, or to make their problems disappear, or to keep their sons out of jail after they'd been beaten half to death for speaking up about their rights. I sank into one of our kitchen chairs, still holding that wallet, and felt like I was seeing my life clearly for the first time in 2 years. Every unexplained absence, every mysterious phone call, every time Thomas had come home flush with cash and claiming he'd won it playing cards with his deputies, it was all part of this. He wasn't just hurting me and Sarah. He was hurting our entire community, one family at a time. Sarah was napping upstairs, and the house was quiet except for the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway and my own heart hammering against my ribs. I knew I should put everything back exactly as I'd found it, drive that wallet to the courthouse, and pretend I'd never seen anything. But I couldn't. Not anymore. Instead, I did something that could have gotten me killed. I took out our little Kodak camera, the one we'd gotten as a wedding gift, and I photographed everything. The money, the list of names, even some other papers I found tucked in different compartments. My hands were shaking so badly that half the pictures probably came out blurry, but I kept clicking that shutter until I'd documented every piece of evidence in that wallet. Then I put it all back exactly where I'd found it, drove to the courthouse, and handed it to Mrs. Parker at the front desk with my sweetest smile. "Thomas forgot this at home," I said, like I was just a dutiful wife doing a favor for her forgetful husband. "You know how men are about their wallets." She laughed and promised to get it right to him, and I drove home with my heart still racing and a roll of film burning a hole in my purse. That afternoon, while Sarah played with her blocks in the living room, I sat at my kitchen table and made a list of my own. Not names and dollar amounts like Thomas's list, but something more important. People who might help me if I ever found the courage to ask. It was a depressingly short list. My sister in Ohio, who I hadn't talked to in over a year. A teacher from high school who'd always said I could call her if I needed anything. Maybe the librarian, Mrs. Foster, who sometimes asked gentle questions about the bruises I couldn't quite hide under makeup. But as I sat there writing names on that paper, something strange happened. For the first time since I'd married Thomas, I didn't feel completely powerless. I had information now, proof of what he was really doing. It might not be enough to stop him, but it was something. It was a weapon. When Thomas came home that evening, he was in one of his better moods. He kissed my cheek, picked up Sarah, and spun her around until she giggled, and even complimented the pot roast I'd made for dinner. "Betty, darling," he said, cutting into his meat, "you're looking particularly beautiful tonight. That blue dress brings out your eyes." I smiled and thanked him, the same way I always did, but inside I was studying him like I'd never seen him before, looking for tells, for signs, for any indication that he suspected what I'd discovered. "Oh, by the way," he added casually, "thanks for bringing my wallet by the office. Don't know how I forgot such an important thing." "Of course," I said, passing him the mashed potatoes. "Can't have the sheriff walking around without his identification." He laughed at that, a genuine sound that reminded me of the man I'd fallen in love with back when I was 19, and naive and believed that love could save anyone from anything. But that woman was gone now. In her place sat someone harder, smarter, and infinitely more dangerous than Thomas Scott could ever imagine. Someone who was finally ready to start fighting back. That night, after Thomas fell asleep with Sarah curled up on his chest in front of the television, I snuck out to the garage and hid that roll of film inside an old paint can behind his fishing gear. Someplace he'd never think to look, but where I could find it again when the time was right. I didn't know when that time would come. Might be months, might be years, but I knew it would come eventually, because men like Thomas always push too far. Always take one more risk, hurt one more person, assume their power will protect them forever. And when that moment arrived, when he finally went too far for even his badge to save him, I'd be ready. With proof, with evidence, with the truth that could bring down the most untouchable man in Harlan County. I just had to survive long enough to use it. 3 years. That's how long I carried that secret, hidden like a loaded gun in a paint can in our garage. 3 years of watching Thomas come home with blood under his fingernails and money in his pockets. 3 years of being locked in that pantry with Sarah, sometimes for hours, while he conducted his business in our kitchen. 3 years of learning to read his moods like my life depended on it, because it did. By 1972, Sarah was 4 years old and starting to ask questions I couldn't answer. "Mama, why does Daddy put us in the dark room?" she asked one morning while I was braiding her hair for Sunday school. Her little voice was so innocent, so trusting. and I had to stop what I was doing to keep my hands from shaking. "It's just a game, sweetheart," I lied, the words tasting like poison in my mouth. "Daddy likes to play hide and seek." But Sarah was smart, too smart for her own good. "It's not fun, Mama, it's scary, and you always cry when we come out." That's when I knew I couldn't keep living this lie much longer, not just for my sake, but for hers. She was old enough now to remember these things, to carry them with her into whatever kind of woman she'd become. And I'd be damned if I let Thomas Scott damage one more innocent person in this family. The end came on a Tuesday night in September, when the leaves were just starting to turn, and there was that first hint of coolness in the Kentucky air that promised winter was coming. Thomas had been drinking since he got home, not his usual controlled drinking, but the desperate, angry kind that meant someone had challenged his authority that day. He was pacing around our living room like a caged animal, still in his uniform, his hand resting on his service weapon, like he was waiting for someone to give him an excuse to use it. Sarah was playing quietly with her dolls in the corner, that special kind of stillness that children learn when they're afraid to draw attention to themselves. I was trying to fold laundry, but mostly I was watching Thomas and calculating how quickly I could get to Sarah if things went bad. "That new district attorney thinks he can waltz into my county and start asking questions," Thomas muttered, taking another pull from his whiskey bottle. "Thinks he can come in here and tell me how to do my job." My blood went cold. A district attorney asking questions was exactly what I'd been hoping for and dreading in equal measure for 3 years. "What kind of questions?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. Thomas stopped pacing and looked at me with those flat, dangerous eyes. The kind of questions that could cause problems for this family if people start telling stories that ain't true. He walked over to where I was sitting and grabbed my chin, forcing me to look up at him. His fingers smelled like gun oil and whiskey, and his grip was hard enough to bruise. "You wouldn't tell stories, would you, Betty? You wouldn't say things that might hurt your husband's reputation?" "Of course not, Thomas. I would never. Because if you did," he continued, like I hadn't spoken, "if you ever decided to run your mouth about things that are none of your business, well, accidents happen. Even to sheriffs' wives. Even to their children." That's when Sarah looked up from her dolls, her big brown eyes wide with confusion and fear. "Mama, why is Daddy being mean?" Something snapped inside me then. Something that had been bending and bending for years under the weight of his threats and his fists, and his absolute certainty that he owned us completely. "Let go of me," I said quietly. Thomas laughed. "What did you say?" "I said let go of me." My voice was stronger this time, and I saw surprise flicker across his face. "Don't threaten our daughter, Thomas. Don't you dare." His grip tightened, and for a second I thought he was going to hit me right there in front of Sarah. But then he seemed to remember where we were, and he released my chin with a little shove that sent me back against the couch cushions. "Sarah, go to your room," he said, not taking his eyes off me. "But Daddy." "Now." Sarah scrambled up from the floor, clutching her favorite doll, and ran upstairs. I heard her bedroom door slam, and then it was just Thomas and me in that living room, staring at each other across a chasm that had been growing wider for 5 years. "You're forgetting your place, Betty," he said softly. "Maybe it's time for a reminder." He started unbuckling his gun belt, and I knew what was coming next. The pantry, maybe for hours this time, given how angry he was. And with a district attorney asking questions and Thomas desperate to maintain control, who knew how far he might go? But as I watched him hang that gun belt on its hook by the door, something clicked in my mind. For the first time in our marriage, Thomas had taken off his weapon while he was still angry. For the first time, he wasn't armed. I stood up slowly, my hands steady for the first time in years. "No." "What?" I said. "No, Thomas. I'm not going in that pantry. And neither is Sarah." He stared at me like I'd started speaking a foreign language. "Betty, you're confused. Maybe you've been drinking." "I haven't been drinking. But you have. And you've been doing a lot of other things too, haven't you? Taking money from people. Hurting kids like Danny Morrison. Making deals with criminals while wearing that badge like it means something." The color drained from Thomas's face. "What did you say?" My heart was hammering so hard I could barely hear my own voice, but I kept talking. "I know about the money, Thomas. I know about the lists of names and the payments and all of it. I've known for 3 years. For a moment, he just stood there, swaying slightly from the whiskey, looking like a man who'd just watched his entire world crumble around him. Then his face went from pale to red to something that looked almost purple, and I knew I'd made a terrible mistake. "You stupid little bitch," he whispered. "You have no idea what you've just done." He lunged for his gun belt, but I was already moving. 5 years of living in fear had taught me to be fast when I needed to be. I reached the hook first, grabbed that heavy leather belt with its loaded weapon, and held it against my chest like a shield. "Stay back, Thomas." We stood there facing each other across our living room, him drunk and furious and desperate. Me terrified, but finally ready to fight for my daughter's future and my own. "Give me that gun, Betty. Give it to me right now, and maybe we can pretend this conversation never happened." "No." My voice was surprisingly steady. "I think it's time for some changes around here." That's when I saw something in Thomas's eyes that I'd never seen before. Not just anger, not just the need to control everything around him. Fear. For the first time in our marriage, Sheriff Thomas Scott was afraid of his 19-year-old wife, who'd learned to fight back. And that fear was about to make him more dangerous than I ever could have imagined. The gun felt heavier than I'd expected. I'd never held Thomas's service weapon before. He was paranoid about anyone touching his equipment, but desperation makes you capable of things you never thought possible. The leather holster was warm from his body heat, and the weight of that .38 Special pressed against my ribs like a heartbeat. "Betty." Thomas's voice had changed completely. Gone was the rage, replaced by something much more calculating, much more dangerous. "Sweetheart, you're not thinking clearly. Put down my gun belt, and let's talk about this like civilized people." But I could see in his eyes that civilized was the last thing on his mind. He was measuring distances, looking for angles, planning his next move like the predator he'd always been. The only difference was that now I could see it clearly. "Talk?" I backed toward the staircase, keeping the gun belt clutched against my chest. "Like we talked about Danny Morrison? Like we talked about all those families you've been bleeding dry for 3 years? You don't understand the complexities of law enforcement, Betty. Sometimes compromises have to be made." Compromises. My voice was getting louder, and I could hear Sarah's bedroom door creak open upstairs. She was listening, trying to figure out why Mama and Daddy were fighting again. "Is that what you call beating a teenager half to death? A compromise?" Thomas took a step toward me, his hands raised like he was approaching a spooked horse. "Lower your voice. You're scaring our daughter." "I'm scaring her?" Something inside me snapped completely then. I'm not the one who locks her in a closet for hours. I'm not the one who comes home covered in blood. I'm not the one threatening to hurt her to keep her mother quiet. That's enough. His mask slipped entirely, and I saw the real Thomas Scott. Not the respected sheriff, not the pillar of the community, but the vicious, controlling man who'd been hiding behind that badge for years. "Give me that gun right now, or I swear to God, Betty, you'll regret it for the rest of your very short life." I was halfway up the stairs when he made his move. Thomas was fast, faster than a drunk man had any right to be. But 3 years of walking on eggshells had taught me to anticipate violence. I felt him grab for my ankle just as I reached the landing, his fingers digging into my skin hard enough to leave marks. "Mama!" Sarah's voice cut through everything, high and scared and heartbroken. I kicked backward with my free foot, catching Thomas somewhere soft that made him grunt and loosen his grip. Then I was running down the hallway toward Sarah's room, my bare feet slipping on the hardwood, that gun belt bouncing against my hip with every step. "Sarah, baby, get under your bed right now." "Mama, what's happening?" "Just do it, sweetheart. Hide and don't come out no matter what you hear." I slammed her bedroom door and turned the lock just as Thomas reached the top of the stairs. His face was twisted with a rage I'd never seen before, even in his worst moments. This wasn't just about control anymore. This was about survival, his and mine. "Open this door, Betty. Open it right now." Instead, I ran to Sarah's window and looked down at our backyard. It was maybe a 12-foot drop to the flower bed below. Survivable, if you were desperate enough. And I was definitely desperate enough. But Sarah. "Mama, I'm scared." Her voice was muffled, coming from under the bed where she'd hidden herself among her stuffed animals and picture books. The door shuddered as Thomas threw his weight against it. The lock wouldn't hold much longer. It was just a simple privacy lock, meant to keep parents from walking in on children changing clothes, not to withstand a 200-pound man bent on violence. I made a decision that still haunts me 45 years later. Sarah, listen to Mama very carefully. I need you to stay hidden until morning, okay? No matter what happens, no matter what you hear, don't come out until the sun is shining through your window. Where are you going, Mama? The door splintered. One more hit, and Thomas would be through. I'm going to make sure you're safe, baby girl. I love you more than all the stars in the sky, remember? I love you too, Mama. I kissed my fingertips and pressed them against the floor where she was hiding, then climbed out that window just as the bedroom door exploded inward. The drop was harder than I'd expected. I landed wrong, twisting my ankle and scraping my palms raw on the gravel. But adrenaline is a powerful thing, and I was up and running before the pain really registered. Behind me, I could hear Thomas shouting Sarah's name, his voice carrying through the broken window. Where is she, Sarah? Where did Mama go? My daughter, bless her brave little heart, didn't answer. I ran through our backyard, then through the Hendersons' yard, then across the empty lot behind the Methodist church. The gun belt was heavy and awkward, banging against my hip with every step, but I held on to it like my life depended on it. Because it did. I had maybe 5 minutes before Thomas realized I'd gone out the window. Maybe 10 minutes before he got to his patrol car and started hunting me with all the resources of the sheriff's department at his disposal. In a county where everyone knew my face, and most people would turn me in without question if the sheriff asked them to. There was only one place I could think to go. One person who might be willing to help the wife of the most powerful man in Harlan County. Mrs. Foster, the librarian who'd always seemed to see more than she let on, who'd asked gentle questions about my bruises and never seemed satisfied with my excuses, who lived alone in a little house 3 blocks from the town square, and had always struck me as the kind of woman who'd stand up to bullies, even if they wore badges. I ran through backyards and alleyways, staying away from the main streets where Thomas's deputies might already be looking for me. My twisted ankle was screaming with every step, and I could feel blood seeping through my torn nightgown where I'd scraped myself climbing out of Sarah's window. But I kept running, because for the first time in 5 years of marriage, I wasn't running away from something. I was running toward my freedom, and toward a confrontation with Thomas Scott that would either save my daughter and me or get us both killed before morning. The gun belt felt heavier with every step, but I held on tight, because I had a feeling that before this night was over, I was going to need it. And this time, I wasn't going to hesitate to use it. Mrs. Foster's porch light was on when I stumbled up her front steps at nearly midnight, bleeding and clutching Thomas's gun belt like a lifeline. I'd always liked Eleanor Foster. She was one of those rare women in our town who'd never married, who owned her own house and drove her own car and didn't seem to need anyone's permission to exist. At 60-something, she had steel gray hair that she wore in a practical bun and eyes that missed nothing behind wire-rimmed glasses. Most importantly, she was the only person in Harlan County who'd ever looked at my bruises and asked direct questions instead of politely pretending not to notice. I knocked on her door with shaking hands, then immediately second-guessed myself. What was I doing? Dragging an innocent woman into my mess? Getting her killed because I was too scared and too desperate to think straight? But before I could turn and run, the porch light flicked on and the door opened. Mrs. Foster took one look at me, torn nightgown, bloody hands, gun belt clutched against my chest, and her face went from sleepy confusion to grim understanding in about 2 seconds. "Betty Scott," she said quietly. "I wondered when you'd end up on my doorstep." She stepped aside to let me in, checking the street carefully before closing and locking the door behind me. Her living room was exactly what you'd expect from a librarian. Books everywhere, a comfortable reading chair by the window, the smell of tea and old paper hanging in the air like incense. "Sit down before you fall down," she said, guiding me to her couch. "Let me get you some water and see about those cuts." I sank into the soft cushions and finally allowed myself to feel the full weight of what had just happened. I'd run. I'd actually run. After 5 years of taking whatever Thomas dished out, I'd finally fought back. and I'd left my 4-year-old daughter alone with him. Sarah, I gasped, trying to stand up again. I have to go back. I left Sarah. Mrs. Foster's firm hand on my shoulder kept me seated. You left Sarah alive, which is more than you both would have been if you'd stayed. She disappeared into her kitchen and came back with a glass of water and a first aid kit. Now tell me what happened. So I did. Everything. The beatings, the pantry, the money I'd found in Thomas's wallet, the protection rackets, the threats against Sarah. Words poured out of me like water from a broken dam. 5 years of secrets and fear and carefully maintained lies finally seeing daylight. Mrs. Foster cleaned my cuts and wrapped my twisted ankle while I talked, her face getting grimmer with every detail. When I got to the part about Thomas threatening Sarah, her hands stilled for a moment. "That son of a bitch," she said quietly, and I'd never heard her curse before. I knew something was wrong, but I never imagined. "You can't tell anyone," I said quickly. "If Thomas finds out I told you." "Betty." She set down the antiseptic and looked me straight in the eyes. "Thomas Scott has been untouchable in this county for too long, but he's not untouchable everywhere." She stood up and walked to an old wooden desk in the corner of her living room, pulling out a manila folder that looked like it had been there for a while. "I've been keeping track of things. Little things. Inconsistencies in arrest reports. Families who suddenly left town after their sons got in trouble. Money changing hands where it shouldn't." My mouth fell open. "You've been investigating Thomas?" "Not officially. But when you spend your days organizing information and your evenings listening to people's whispered conversations, you start to notice patterns." She sat back down beside me, the folder in her lap. "I just never had proof. Never had a witness willing to come forward." "I can't be a witness," I said, panic rising in my chest. "If I testify against him, he'll kill me. He'll kill Sarah." "Not if he's in federal custody, he won't." "Federal." The word hung in the air between us like a prayer. "There's an FBI field office in Lexington," Mrs. Foster continued. "They've been looking into corruption in rural sheriff's departments across Kentucky. I've been corresponding with an agent there, sending anonymous tips. But they need someone with inside knowledge, someone who's seen the evidence firsthand." I thought about that roll of film hidden in our garage, the photographs I'd taken of Thomas's lists and money 3 years ago, evidence that could bring down the most powerful man in our county, if I was brave enough to use it. "There's something else," I said slowly. "Photos. I took pictures of documents from his wallet years ago, hidden them in our garage." Mrs. Foster's eyes lit up behind her glasses. "What kind of documents?" "Lists of names and payments, the money he was taking from families, dates and amounts." I met her gaze. Proof. For the first time since I'd known her, Eleanor Foster smiled like a woman who'd just been handed the key to the kingdom. "Betty, honey, you might have just given us what we need to put Thomas Scott away for a very long time." But before I could respond, we heard the sound that had been haunting my nightmares for 5 years. The distinctive rumble of Thomas's patrol car prowling slowly down the street. Mrs. Foster immediately killed the lights and pulled me away from the windows. We crouched there in the darkness, listening to that engine get closer and closer until the sound stopped right in front of her house. Through a crack in the curtains, I could see Thomas sitting in his car, his face illuminated by the green glow of his radio. He was talking to someone, probably his deputies, organizing a search. His free hand was drumming against the steering wheel, a habit he had when he was thinking hard about something, or planning something violent. "He knows I'm here," I whispered. "Maybe, maybe not. But he can't just break down my door without a warrant, badge or no badge. Even in Harlan County, some rules still apply." We waited in that darkness for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Finally, the patrol car's engine started again, and Thomas drove away. But I knew he wasn't giving up. This was just the beginning. "Mrs. Foster," I said, still watching the empty street through her curtains. "If I do this, if I testify against Thomas, there's no going back. He'll never stop hunting us. Sarah and I will have to disappear forever." She was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was gentle but firm. "Betty, honey, some cages can only be opened from the outside, and some monsters can only be stopped by people brave enough to stand up and name them for what they are. I thought about Sarah, hiding under her bed in a house with a man who'd just threatened to kill us both. I thought about Danny Morrison and all the other young men who'd been beaten, or worse, because they dared to challenge Thomas's authority. I thought about all the families paying protection money to keep their loved ones safe from the very man who was supposed to be protecting them. And I made a decision that would change everything. How do we contact the FBI? Mrs. Foster was already reaching for her telephone. Leave that to me, honey. By morning, we're going to have some very interested federal agents who want to hear your story. Outside, I could hear Thomas's patrol car making another pass down the street. Hunting, searching, getting more desperate with every passing hour. But for the first time in 5 years, I wasn't afraid of him anymore. I was ready to fight back. And this time, I wasn't fighting alone. The FBI agents arrived at Mrs. Foster's house at 6 in the morning, just as the sun was painting the Kentucky hills gold, and I was pacing her living room like a caged animal, worried sick about Sarah. Agent Patricia Coleman was not what I'd expected. Maybe 5 feet tall in her sensible heels, with short brown hair and the kind of quiet intensity that made you want to tell her everything you'd ever done wrong in your life. Her partner, Agent Robert Hayes, was her complete opposite. Tall, broad-shouldered, with kind eyes that reminded me of my daddy before the mine took him. Mrs. Scott, Agent Coleman said after Mrs. Foster had made the introductions and poured coffee for everyone. We understand you have information about corruption in the Harlan County Sheriff's Department. I nodded, my hands shaking as I lifted my coffee cup. My husband, Thomas, he's been taking money, hurting people, for years. We need specifics, Agent Hayes said gently. Names, dates, amounts. And we need proof. So, I told them everything. Again. Every beating, every night locked in the pantry, every dollar I'd seen change hands, every threat Thomas had made. Agent Coleman took notes in a small black notebook, asking sharp questions that cut right to the heart of things. You mentioned photographs, she said, when I got to the part about Thomas's wallet. Do you still have access to them? They're hidden in our garage, in a paint can behind his fishing gear. I swallowed hard. But I'd have to go back to the house to get them. The 2 agents exchanged a look that made my stomach clench. Mrs. Scott, Agent Coleman said carefully. Going back to that house would be extremely dangerous. Your husband has been searching for you all night. He's desperate, which makes him unpredictable. But my daughter is there, I said, my voice breaking. I left my 4-year-old daughter with him. What kind of mother does that make me? Agent Hayes leaned forward. It makes you a mother who saved both your lives by getting out when you had the chance. If you'd stayed, we might be investigating 2 murders instead of corruption charges. The words hit me like a physical blow, but I knew he was right. Thomas had been building to something violent for months. Last night had just been the final straw. What about Sarah? I asked. How do we get her away from him? We're working on that, Agent Coleman said. But first, we need those photographs. Without hard evidence, this becomes your word against a respected sheriff's. And unfortunately, that's not enough to build a federal case. Mrs. Foster, who'd been quietly listening from her kitchen chair, suddenly spoke up. What if Betty didn't have to go back alone? All 3 of us turned to look at her. I've been thinking, she continued. Thomas expects Betty to be hiding, running scared. He doesn't expect her to come back for evidence, and he certainly doesn't expect her to have backup. Agent Coleman frowned. Ma'am, we can't ask a civilian to. You're not asking, Mrs. Foster interrupted. I'm volunteering. I know that house, I know the neighborhood, and I know Thomas Scott better than you do. He won't see an old librarian as a threat. Absolutely not, I said immediately. Mrs. Foster, you've done enough. I won't let you risk your life for Betty. Her voice was firm. That man has terrorized this county for years. He's hurt children, extorted families, and turned our sheriff's department into his personal criminal organization. Someone has to stop him. Agent Hayes was shaking his head. It's too dangerous. If Sheriff Scott discovers what we're doing, then we better not get discovered, Mrs. Foster said, with a smile that reminded me why I'd always admired her. Now, what's the plan? What happened next? felt like something out of a movie. Agent Coleman spread a map of our neighborhood across Mrs. Foster's kitchen table, and we planned the operation like military strategists. Mrs. Foster would drive me to the house during Thomas's regular patrol rounds. He was predictable in his habits, always checking the same areas at the same times. I'd slip into the garage, retrieve the film, and be gone within 5 minutes. Simple, clean, foolproof. Except nothing involving Thomas Scott was ever simple. We drove to my house at 10:30, when Thomas should have been across town checking on the businesses that paid him protection money. Mrs. Foster parked her old Buick 2 blocks away, and I approached through the neighbors' backyards, my heart hammering so hard I was sure everyone in Kentucky could hear it. The garage was exactly as I'd left it. Thomas's fishing gear hanging on pegboard walls, his workbench covered with tools he never used, and tucked behind everything, that old paint can with my secret hidden inside. I was reaching for the can when I heard footsteps on the gravel driveway. Heavy footsteps. Familiar footsteps. Thomas was home early. I crouched behind a stack of paint cans, barely breathing, as the garage door started to rumble open. Sunlight flooded in, and I could see Thomas's boots as he walked into the space, so close I could have reached out and touched them. "I know you're in here, Betty," he said quietly. "I know you came back for something. Question is, what's so important that you'd risk your life to get it?" I stayed perfectly still, praying he wouldn't look behind the paint cans, wouldn't notice the disturbed dust where I'd been searching. But Thomas hadn't been sheriff for 6 years without learning how to read a crime scene. "Well, well," he said, and I heard the metallic click of his service weapon being drawn from its holster. "What do we have here?" That's when I realized I was about to die in my own garage, killed by the man I'd once loved, while my daughter was probably watching from her bedroom window upstairs. And the evidence that could have saved us both was still sitting in that paint can, just inches from my trembling fingers. But sometimes, when you think all hope is lost, cavalry arrives in the most unexpected forms. The sound of multiple car doors slamming in our driveway was like music from heaven. "FBI, Sheriff Scott, put down your weapon." Agent Coleman's voice cut through the garage like a blade, and I heard Thomas curse in a way that would have made his mother wash his mouth out with soap. "This is federal property now, Sheriff. Step away from the garage and keep your hands where we can see them." What happened next was chaos. Shouting, running footsteps, Thomas screaming about jurisdiction and federal overreach while Agent Hayes tackled him to our driveway. I crawled out from behind those paint cans, clutching that roll of film like it was made of gold, tears streaming down my face. Through our kitchen window, I could see Sarah pressed against the glass, her little face confused and scared but alive. Still alive. "Mama," she screamed when she saw me. "Mama, you came back." And that's when I knew we were finally safe. Thomas Scott, the untouchable sheriff of Harlan County, was face down on his own driveway in handcuffs, screaming about his rights while federal agents read him his charges. The nightmare was over. But the hardest part, rebuilding our lives from the ashes of everything I'd thought was true, was just beginning. 3 months after Thomas's arrest, Sarah and I were living in a 2-bedroom apartment in Cincinnati, Ohio, under names that weren't quite our own. The FBI had been thorough. Those photographs I'd hidden in the paint led to a federal investigation that uncovered corruption reaching far beyond Harlan County. Thomas wasn't just taking protection money. He was part of a network that stretched across 3 states, involving judges, prosecutors, and sheriffs who'd turned their badges into licenses to steal. But breaking a criminal organization and healing a broken family are 2 very different things. Sarah woke up screaming most nights, calling for her daddy. Not the man who'd locked us in closets and threatened our lives, but the version of Thomas who'd read her bedtime stories and spun her around the living room until she giggled. 4-year-olds don't understand corruption charges or federal investigations. They just know their world got turned upside down and nothing feels safe anymore. "Where's Daddy?" she asked me one morning over breakfast, her little voice so small and lost it broke my heart into pieces. How do you explain to a child that her father was never the hero she thought he was? How do you tell her that the man she loved was the same man who'd made our lives a living hell? "Daddy had to go away for a while," I said, stirring sugar into my coffee and trying to keep my voice steady. "But you and Mama are safe now. That's what matters." "But I miss him, Mama. I miss our house and my room and everything." I pulled her into my lap, this precious little girl who'd been through more trauma in her 4 years than most people experience in a lifetime. I know, baby. I miss some things too. And I did. Not Thomas. God help me, I was grateful every day that he was locked up in federal prison, but I missed the illusion of safety he'd provided. I missed belonging somewhere, having a place in the world that made sense. I missed not having to look over my shoulder every time I walked to the grocery store. The FBI had assured us that Thomas couldn't reach us from prison, but fear isn't always rational. When you've lived in terror for 5 years, freedom feels dangerous in its own way. I got a job at a diner near our apartment, serving coffee and pie to truckers and factory workers who didn't know my story. The tips weren't much, but combined with the small survivors fund the Federal Victim Services had arranged, it was enough to keep us fed and housed. Most days were okay. Sarah started preschool and slowly began making friends. I learned to sleep without jumping at every sound. We developed new routines, new rhythms that didn't revolve around reading Thomas's moods and calculating how to survive another day. But some days were harder. Like the afternoon in November when Sarah came home from preschool and announced that her friend Jessica's daddy was a policeman. "He has a badge just like Daddy had," she said, coloring at our little kitchen table. "Jessica says policemen are heroes who catch bad guys." I stood at our sink washing dishes, my hands trembling as I tried to figure out how to respond. How do you explain that sometimes the people wearing badges are the bad guys? That sometimes heroes and monsters wear the same uniform? "People are complicated, sweetheart," I finally said. "Sometimes they do good things, and sometimes they do bad things. What matters is how we choose to treat each other." Did Daddy do bad things? The question hung in the air between us like smoke. I turned around to face my daughter, this brave little girl who deserved honesty, even if the truth was painful. "Yes, baby. Daddy did some very bad things. That's why he had to go away. But he loved us, didn't he?" And there it was, the question that had been haunting me for months. Did Thomas love us? In his twisted, controlling way, maybe he thought he did. But love doesn't lock people in closets. Love doesn't threaten to hurt children. Love doesn't turn protection into imprisonment. "I think Daddy loved the idea of having a family," I said carefully. "But he didn't know how to love us the right way, the way that makes people feel safe and happy." Sarah considered this with the serious expression she got when she was working through something difficult. "Do you think he misses us?" "I don't know, sweetheart. But I know we're better without him." That night, after Sarah was asleep, I sat at our kitchen table writing a letter I'd been putting off for months. Agent Coleman had told me that victim impact statements could influence Thomas's sentencing, and while part of me wanted him to rot in prison forever, another part of me needed him to understand what he'd done to us. Asterisk. Thomas. Asterisk. Asterisk. I don't know if you'll read this, but I need to say it anyway. Asterisk. Asterisk. You took 5 years of my life. You took my daughter's sense of safety. You took our ability to trust, to feel secure, to believe that love doesn't come with conditions and threats. Asterisk. Asterisk. But you know what you didn't take? Asterisk. Asterisk. Our strength. Our determination to build something better. Our capacity to heal. Asterisk. Asterisk. Sarah is thriving now. She's making friends, learning to read, discovering that the world can be beautiful when you're not afraid all the time. She still misses you sometimes, but she's learning that missing someone who hurt you is okay. It doesn't mean you have to go back to them. Asterisk. Asterisk. As for me, I'm learning who I am when I'm not walking on eggshells. I'm stronger than I thought, braver than I knew, and I'm building a life for Sarah and me that's based on love, not fear. Asterisk. Asterisk. You're going to prison for a long time, and that's exactly what you deserve. But I want you to know that Sarah and I aren't victims anymore. We're survivors. Asterisk. Asterisk. And we're going to be just fine without you. Asterisk. Betty. I never sent that letter. Instead, I folded it up and put it in a box with all the other pieces of our old life. Photos, documents, memories I wasn't ready to throw away, but didn't need to carry with me anymore. 3 months became, 6 months became a year. Sarah started kindergarten and stopped asking about her daddy. I got promoted to shift manager at the diner and started dating a kind man named Robert who worked at the tire factory and had never raised his voice to anyone in his life. The nightmares faded. The jumping at loud noises stopped. Slowly, carefully, we began to trust that our new life was real and permanent and safe. But healing isn't linear, and some scars never fully disappear. The day Thomas was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison, Agent Coleman called to let me know. I thanked her, hung up the phone, and then sat on my kitchen floor and cried for an hour. Not because I was sad, but because it was finally, truly over. That night, Sarah and I made chocolate chip cookies and watched cartoons until way past her bedtime. We were celebrating, though she didn't know it. We were celebrating freedom, safety, and the future we'd fought so hard to claim. "Mama," she said as I was tucking her into bed, "are we going to be okay?" "Yes, baby girl," I said, kissing her forehead. "We're going to be more than okay. We're going to be happy." And for the first time since I was 19 years old, I actually believed it. But this story isn't over yet. Because sometimes, the most important part isn't surviving the nightmare. It's finding the courage to help others escape their own. 45 years have passed since that terrible night when I climbed out of Sarah's bedroom window with Thomas's gun belt clutched against my chest. 45 years of birthdays and Christmases, graduations and weddings, grandchildren who call me Grandma Betty and have never known a world where women can't speak their truth. Sarah grew up to be a social worker who helps domestic violence survivors find their way to safety. She married a gentle man who makes her laugh and has never once raised his voice to her or their children. Thomas died in prison in 1998. Heart attack, they said. I felt nothing when Agent Coleman called to tell me. Not relief, not sadness, just a quiet recognition that a chapter had finally closed. But some stories don't end with the death of the villain. Sometimes they begin there. I'm 81 years old now, sitting in my living room in the house Sarah bought me when she became successful, looking at all of you through this camera, and I need you to understand why I'm telling this story. Because Thomas Scott wasn't unique. He wasn't some rare monster who happened to wear a badge. He was one of thousands of men who use their authority to terrorize the people they're supposed to protect. And for every woman who finds the courage to escape, there are dozens more still trapped, still believing that no one will help them because their abuser is untouchable. Last week, a young woman approached me at the grocery store. She'd seen my name in an old newspaper article about police corruption and wanted to talk. Her husband is a state trooper. He beats her, controls every dollar she spends, threatens to take their children away if she ever tries to leave. She wanted to know how I did it, how I found the courage to run. And I realized that's why I survived everything Thomas put me through. Not just to save Sarah and me, but to be here 45 years later, telling you that it's possible to escape. That untouchable men can be touched by justice if enough people are willing to stand up and demand it. The girl at the grocery store, let's call her Jennifer, she reminds me of myself at 19. Scared, isolated, convinced that no one would believe her if she told the truth about the hero everyone thinks they know. But here's what I told Jennifer, and here's what I'm telling all of you. You are not alone. You are not crazy. You are not weak. If someone is hurting you, it doesn't matter what badge they wear or what uniform they put on. It doesn't matter if the whole town thinks they're a saint. It doesn't matter if they've convinced you that you'll never survive without them. You deserve safety. You deserve peace. You deserve to live without fear. And there are people who will help you find your way out, even when it seems impossible. But most importantly, I want you to know that leaving is possible. It's terrifying. It's complicated. It might take years of planning, but it's possible. I was 19 years old, with a baby, and no money, and no education beyond high school. If I could find my way out of Harlan County, Kentucky, in 1972, you can find your way out of wherever you are right now. Don't wait for the perfect moment. Don't wait until you have enough money saved, or until the children are older, or until you're sure you can make it on your own. Perfect moments don't exist when you're living with someone who hurts you. But courage. Courage can be found in the smallest acts of rebellion, in photographing evidence, in reaching out to one trusted person, in believing that you deserve better than what you're getting. Sarah asked me once why I stayed with Thomas for 5 years instead of leaving after the first time he hit me. And I told her what I'm telling you now. Because leaving an abuser isn't like walking away from a bad job or ending a relationship that isn't working. It's like escaping from prison when the warden holds all the keys and everyone outside thinks he's a model citizen. But it can be done. I'm living proof that it can be done. So, if this story reaches even one person who needs to hear it, if it gives even one woman or man the courage to reach out for help, if it saves even one child from growing up the way Sarah had to grow up, then every nightmare I survived was worth it. Your story doesn't have to end the way mine almost did. Your children don't have to carry the scars that come from living in a house where love and violence sleep in the same bed. There is a way out. There are people who will help you find it. You just have to be brave enough to take the first step. You are stronger than you know. You are braver than you believe, and you are worth saving. If my story helped you in any way, please hit that like button and share it with someone who might need to hear it. Leave a comment letting other survivors know they're not alone. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is witness each other's pain and celebrate each other's courage. And subscribe to this channel, because I'm not done talking yet. There are more stories that need telling, more truths that need speaking, more people who need to know that escape is possible. Thank you for listening to an old woman's story. Thank you for believing survivors, and thank you for being part of the solution.